Okay. In the next couple of slides, we'll be talking about margins and price relationships in a channel context. So let's assume that we're trying to calculate the following from a retailer's perspective. So M stands for margin, represented in percentage terms, right? So SP stands for the retailer's selling price. PP stands for the retailer's purchase price. So if PP is a retailer's purchase price, so that means that the prior player in the value chain will be the wholesaler or a distributor. Let's say it's a wholesaler. So if PP is a retailer's purchase price, then that will be equivalent to the wholesaler's selling price, right? So it just depends on how you frame it, in terms of this value chain. So a retailer's purchase price, since they buy it from the wholesaler's selling price would be equivalent to the retailer's purchase price. So having said that then, so the equation, the formula would be M equals, right? The margin equals SP minus PP over SP. So it's the difference between the selling price and the purchase price. So again, this is from the retailer's perspective, divided by the selling price. So that's the key information here. When you're calculating the margin, you have to divide it by the selling price, not the purchase price. So if we solve for this equation, you multiply SP on both sides, and then at the very end, it's pretty self-explanatory. This is very basic algebra. SP then equals PP divided by 1 minus margin, right? So SP, the selling price, so you can go from margin. So if you know the margin, you can calculate the selling price and the purchase price. So SP equals PP divided by 1 minus margin, or the purchase price is SP times 1 minus margin, right? Again, from the retailer's perspective, that will be the retailer's purchase price, or that will be the wholesaler's selling price, right? So let's take a look at some examples. So if a firm's cost is $25 and it wants to make a margin of 40%, what is the price that it has to charge, right? So if it costs $25, or if we bought it at $25 and it wants to make a margin of 40%, then what price does it have to charge, given that we know that it bought it at 25, but it wants to make a margin of 40%. So that means that we're trying to calculate the selling price, right? So based on the previous slide's equation, the selling price for this company would be 25 times 1 minus 40%, which is 25 divided by 0.6, and that gives you 41.67. So if you want to check to see if this answer is right, it'd be 41.67 minus 25 divided by the selling price, which is 41.67, and that will give you 40%. So let's look at this next example. Sunglass World sells its sunglasses for $27.95 at a 14% margin, while the wholesaler and the supplier each get a 20% margin. What is the wholesaler's selling price to Sunglass World? So in this example, Sunglass sells let's say that Sunglass is a retailer, and it sells its sunglasses at $27.95, and it makes a margin of 14%. So then the question is, what is the wholesaler's selling price to Sunglass World? Another way of framing this is, what is the purchase price of Sunglass World? It's the same thing, right? So like we said before, if the wholesaler's selling price, if the question is asking the wholesale selling price to Sunglass World, that's equivalent to saying, what is the purchase price of Sunglass World from this wholesaler? So based on the equation that we talked about in the previous slide, so PP, which is the purchase price of Sunglass World from this wholesaler, is SP times 1 minus margin, which is then $27.95 times 1 minus 0.14, so that's $27.95 times, 0.86, which gives you 24.04. So, which brings us to this example of channel margins. Okay, so channel margins is an example of, as you go down the value chain all the way from margins to the consumer, right? Each consumer is going to, each player in this value chain is going to, they're going to have skin in the game. Therefore, they're going to have to realize some type of margin to do business. So if it costs the manufacturer $4 to make the product, let's say the variable cost is $4, and it sells it to the wholesaler at $7.50, right? $7.50, then the UC, which stands for unit contribution, or the margin for the unit margin, is $3.50, which is $7.50 minus $4, so it's $3.50. So then the margin is what? Is $3.50 divided by $7.50, which gives you 47%, right? So that margin 47% is calculated as $3.50 divided by $7.50. So if the next player is the wholesaler, right? So the selling price to the wholesaler is $7.50. So the wholesaler buys it. The purchasing price for the wholesaler is $7.50. So, and if it sells this product to the retailer, the next player down the value chain at $8.70, then the UC, the unit contribution, again, the unit margin is $1.20, which is $8.70 minus $7.50. So then the margin is now, right, $1.20 divided by $8.70, which will give you 13.8%. So then the same logic can be applied, right? So the retailer buys it from the wholesaler at $8.70, sells it to the consumer at $10. So therefore, the unit contribution is $1.30. Therefore, the margin is $1.30 divided by $10, which is 13%. And then the consumer buys it from the retailer at $10. So as you can see here, as you go from top to bottom, from the manufacturer to the consumer, or the price continues to increase from what, $4 to all the way down to $10. Why? Because every player, every intermediary has to realize some type of, some margin, some profitability. Therefore, the more players, the more intermediaries there are in this channel, it's like a snowballing effect, right? Every player is going to have to, realize some type of margin. And therefore, at the end of the day, the consumer ends up paying a lot more compared to if there were only a few intermediaries. All right, this slide shows you the difference between margin versus markup. So this table shows you, okay, if you buy it at $1 and then you sell it at $2, and then the next player buys it at $2, sells it at $2.50, and then sells it at $2.50. So the next player buys it at $2.50 and then sells it at $2.75. The next player buys it at $2.75 and then ultimately sells it at $4.50. As we learned before, the margin is 50%. Why? Because it's $2, the selling price minus the purchase price, 2 minus 1, divided by the selling price, which is $2. So that's, right, 1 over 2, which is 50%. However, the markup, in contrast to the margin, is 100%. Why? Because the markup, the formula for the markup is the selling price minus the purchase price. So it's 2 minus 1. And now you divided that by the purchase price, not the selling price, as was the case for margin. So for markup, it's 2 minus 1 over 1. That's why it's 100%. Again, for the next one, the margin is 20%, whereas the markup is 25%. Why is the margin 20%? It's because you're selling it, you're buying it at $2, and you're selling it at $2.50. So that's $2.50 minus $2, which is 50 cents. So it's 50 cents over the selling price, $2.50, and that gives you 20%. Whereas the markup now is 50 cents over the purchase price, which is $2, and that gives you 25%. So as you can see, the same logic goes for the third column, which is 9%, 10%, and then the last column, which is 39%, and the 64%. So let's look at this, for the entire chain. So for the entire chain, it says the markup is 350%. So how did we get that? So we buy it at $150, and then the ultimate end up selling price is $450. So it's $450 minus $1, that's $350, and then you divide that by the purchase price, which is $1, so it's $350, right? So that's 350%. Whereas the margin, on the other hand, is $450 minus $1, which gives you $350, divided by the selling price, which is $450. Right? So it's $350 divided by $450, which gives you, what is it? It's 78%. So as you can see in this entire value chain, as you go from the manufacturer to the distributor to the wholesaler to the retailer, for the entire value chain, the markup is $350, whereas the margin is 78%. That's a huge difference. So that just goes to show you how different the markup is from the margin. So I don't want students to get confused between these two different concepts, because I know that these two are used interchangeably and used very loosely, in the business press and, in everyday conversation. But strictly speaking, technically speaking, these two are completely different concepts. And I've shown you how different how significantly they are different using some numbers, right? One is almost, 4 times greater than the other. So let's not confuse the two concepts, when we use this, either in conversations or when we're, engaging in a dialogue with other channel members. Because now that we know how these two are different, we need to use these in the correct manner.